heard something. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Generic Garage. On today's episode, we are back on the Shogun. You can see it sitting here behind me. It's been a couple of months again, and again, I've been working on ordering parts and getting things done in the meantime. So here's a quick overview of the things that have gotten done in the past couple of weeks. On the last episode, we left off at the steering rack and the lack of a bushing inside of the steering rack on the passenger side, so I went back over to my buddy's place and had him machine up some Delrin rod, and this little bushing fits in here perfectly. It's a slide interference fit, maybe 1 to 2 thousandths of interference, but it fits in there perfectly, and the rest of the steering rack is put back together with the tie rod ends. After that, I needed to remove that center plate that held the motor mounts and then move on to the lower radiator supports. I cut out the lower radiator supports and I removed these old bushings. They're pretty well worn, but they sit inside of these brackets, and so the idea is going to be that I need to create new brackets. And then I needed to purchase new bushings. These old bushings are pretty worn, and I ended up ordering 2 different sets because I wasn't sure which ones were going to work. So anyways, I moved on to creating those brackets and I got them welded up to the Festiva after centering up the radiator. Everything was looking pretty good, and the bushings that I got for the lowers fit in pretty dang well. I ended up using, I think, some lower radiator mounts off of a Mazda CX-7, like a 2001 and up. And I had also ordered a different set from Dorman. I want to say the part number on those two is 7T4Z-8124-A and B6DG-15-202. So anyways, the radiator's sitting in there on the bottom supports just fine. And so then I needed to go ahead and move on to mounting the condenser to the radiator. I used a bunch of really long stainless 832 thread screws and a bunch of nuts and really just over-engineered the heck out of this thing and attached it with a good 6 or 7 screws on the top and created a mounting plate for the bottom, which was again mounted with some 832 screws. You can't really see it because it's hidden down there, but that was all in. After that, I needed to get the fuel tank in. So the fuel tank was from the Festiva, and I just threw some angle iron into the engine bay and then set the tank in there. I drilled some holes on the left and the right at the front where some bolts are going to be run through, but I still need to find a way to mount the tank at the rear. After that, I moved on to brakes. That was a fun one. I started off by creating brand new lines for the fronts, and then I moved on to creating brand new lines for the rears. At the rears, I had to mount the flexible hoses, and funny enough, the sizing on the left and the right side are different as far as where they're held. But here's a capture of all of the lines and the flaring tool and all the ends that I ended up using there. And so once the fronts were done, I moved on to the rear lines, got those run down all the way underneath the car. I'm gonna have to 3D print or find some mounts to hold those lines up to the bottom of the car. But you can see here, it comes out the bottom, goes over and then up, and I'm having a problem bleeding the brakes, and I think it's probably because of the way that I mounted those flexible lines with that top curve over. And yeah, I'm probably gonna end up having to redo that and maybe relocate those lines down lower in the vehicle, because for whatever reason, I've bled these things like 3 or 4 times and the pedal still goes to the floor. Okay, so once again, the radiator is installed with a condenser. Here is the upper mounts that were created and installed in the similar fashion to the lower mounts. Again, those are 2 different bushings for the top and the bottom, but either set will work, so get whichever. I installed the new master cylinder. Everything's bled, like I said. The pedal still goes to the floor. Even though it goes to the floor, it does still stop the car. It's like the last 1/4 inch of the pedal does all of the braking. So now I need to move on to the fuel system. I took the tank out in the driveway and took the pressure washer to it with a bunch of iron out because there was still about a 1/4 inch of gas left in there, and that tank was super rusty. So, well, Here is a pretty good representation of how that tank looked everywhere on the inside. So I took it out into the street in front of the house with the pressure washer and went after it for a good hour, hour and a half with some iron out, and got the tank pretty dang clean. And now there is a bunch of rust sitting out in the street, kind of running down towards my neighbor's house, and I'm sure they appreciate that. Moving back onto the fuel system, I used the sending unit from the old Festiva as a reference to create this plate. We're going to reuse the old gasket for now until I get some new gasket material. And then I found this sending unit for the level from the Festiva store, and they said it would work for the 90 or 91 and up, whichever ones were the EFIs, but they weren't sure if it was going to work on the older style carbureted motors in the Festiva, but we're going to make it work. It fits in there. I've already tested all of this. It should work out just fine. So on this plate here, this will mount right here on this plate, and we'll use these screws to hold that in. These wires for the fuel gauge will run up through here, and we'll have to seal that somehow. And then I drilled 3 really big holes for these AN to barb bulkhead adapters. And the idea here is that this will be flipped over. These bar fittings will sit down inside and go into the tank so that I can run some 5/16 hose. And then one of these is an outlet that we'll put a pickup screen on so that we catch any of the rust particulates that are still floating around in the tank before it even gets picked up and sent over to the fuel pump. So we have one hole for an outlet here, and that'll run over here to this fuel pump. Now this fuel pump is a 300 liter per hour fuel pump at like 43 PSI. The regulator that is on the show motor is actually not good enough to control that amount of fuel at that pressure. So that's why we have 2 return lines here into this plate. So before we actually send it over to the motor, we have to pre-regulate the fuel with this fuel regulator, and then we'll send it onto a 100 micron fuel filter into the fuel pump, and then out of the fuel pump with a 10 micron fuel filter. And then from there, we'll run these PTFE fuel hoses. I went with the PTFE because I had issues on the Ranger where we used that rubber style line, and after it sat for a while, I started to get all of these little pinhole leaks, but the PTFE holds up for everything. So do yourself a favor, spend the extra money and get the PTFE stuff. This Teflon stuff is great, works fantastic, no complaints here. And then we'll run into the normal Ford O-ring style fittings that are converted to the AN lines here. I found these old style spring lock to barb fittings from Napa, but we're not going to use that old style fuel hose, so we'll set these aside for now. So again, we're going to come out of the tank, AN line, fuel filter, regulator, fuel pump, secondary fuel filter, Teflon lines, over to the spring lock to AN fittings, and that should be it for the fuel system. Once the fuel system is done, then I can get to work on putting all of the wiring and electronics back into the car and getting it to the point where I can put the key into the Festiva, turn the key, and hopefully crank the motor over. Now, we're not quite ready to start the engine just yet from there. I need to get a new clutch and a new throwout bearing because I need to be able to depress the clutch for that neutral safety lockout switch and the clutch safety switch, all that's in there. But we might be able to start it up before then. I just don't want to have anything like moving around or clinking around or being real loose and messing up any of the flywheel, clutch plate, bearing, any of that kind of stuff. So we might do that before we try to start the motor. And of course, just because we can start the motor doesn't mean we can run it for that long. I still need to get the coolant system figured out on the car. Now, that water pump that's on the motor isn't actually strong enough to push the coolant all the way from the back of the car to the front of the car where the radiator is, through the radiator, and then all the way to the back of the car where the motor is. So what we have to do is take these 2 of these aluminum tubes, run one up all the way over to here with some rubber hoses and bends and whatnot. It'll come into here, it'll go through the radiator, and then it will come out down below. And right there, I will have to put an auxiliary water pump that will help push the coolant all the way back to the motor in the back, and then we'll have to do some sort of controller for that water pump and temperature sensor to control when the water pump comes on and off, and probably modify the thermostat a little bit, drill a hole or two in it just so water continuously flows. And if that water pump down below is turned on and the thermostat isn't quite opened up yet, we don't want to be restricting the flow of the coolant because we can mess up that auxiliary water pump. There's a lot to consider in all of that. But for now, I'm gonna get this fuel system put together and run back to the motor so that we have our brakes, we have our fuel system knocked out, and then we'll move on to the electrical. All right, well, it took a couple of days and I had to order some parts and return some parts, but I think I got the car to the point where we might be able to try to start it real quick. I checked the oil's good. I think I have all the electrical done, but let's just do a quick recap on what happened. So I got the sending unit all put together. Out of the sending unit is the main line that feeds the 100 micron filter down below the rack there. Then it goes into the fuel pump, from the fuel pump to a 10 micron filter. From the 10 micron filter, it runs up this line right here into the regulator. The regulator return line is this one right here, runs back into the tank. Then it comes out of the regulator and goes all the way back to the fuel rail in the back. Out of the fuel rail, it comes back after the regulator on the fuel rail, all the way up to the front of the car, through this line here and back into the tank. So 2 returns, 1 outlet. Fuel regulator is right here, and I already jumped the fuel pump and got the pressure set right and checked for leaks, and everything seems okay there. At the back, there is the 2 push lock fittings from Ford. So there is your inlet, it's the bigger one, and there is your return, it's the smaller one. One of the issues that I ran into there was I had ordered both of those fittings from Russell, and everybody online said don't use the one from Russell, but I said I'm gonna give it a shot, I'm gonna test it. The inlet works fine. Fuel inlet, great, perfect, nothing wrong with it. So the issue with the Russell return is that there is a spring in the fitting, and of course this is the barb fitting, but that fitting does not have enough room for that spring to expand. So when you go to push this onto the fuel rail, it can't go on. That spring can't go anywhere. So don't order the return line fitting from Russell. Order it from Aeromotive, and that's part number 15123. Anyways, a little more expensive, but it ends up working. So that's what you got to do there. Other than that, we had to get started on wiring. There's a ton of wiring here. I pulled off everything from the Taurus. That's the body control module right there. All of this is for your lights, your door buzzer, your push switches for your door to see if they're open or closed, your door locks, your power windows, basically a bunch of stuff that we're not gonna need on that side. Our stereo is down there somewhere, or our stereo wires, but those plug in, I think, like to this connector here. And there's another one somewhere else. We're not gonna need our gauge, our cluster from the show, but I hooked it up just in case we needed to do like an ECU test in case this thing doesn't fire up or it runs funny. And then our windshield wiper switch, our light controller for our headlights, all that kind of stuff is in here. So I gotta go through this wire by wire and basically say, hey, I need this, keep it, or I don't, and cut it out. And then we'll have to run power into the harness for the Festiva, and hopefully just putting power to the fuse block in the Festiva, everything just kind of still works. And we'll have to figure out a couple things here and there. But for the most part, everything that's in the engine bay here is needed. So we're gonna keep all of this kind of stuff. I'll have to figure out a home for the battery. I think sometimes they mount it up there. We might put it under the hood, but then I'd have to get longer battery wires. We'll figure that out. I need to create some ground points where I can screw grounds to, some to the engine, some to the frame. For right now, they're just kind of stuck in there. So battery, negative, positive. Wires are hooked up. I do get lights when I put positive on here. And we got, that was the door buzzer, I think, telling us it thinks the door is open. But anyways, lights are coming on, nothing's catching on fire. So I think our wiring is set up the way it needs to be. I spent a couple hours going through all the wiring harness stuff and looking at everything. I replaced all of the spark plugs. I got new spark plug wires, and they're red from Taylor. So there's a few horsepower. Woohoo! Inside there is stuff for blinkers and headlights and all that kind of stuff. And then there is the control module that has a couple relays in it for the fuel pump, which has 2 stages, a low, like idle, and then a high, which is, I guess, when you're getting up there in 7,000 RPM range and you need to make sure you have all the fuel that you need. So all of this is hooked up the way that it needs to be, I think. And I did a little bit of testing just to make sure. Over here, this would be what connects directly to your ignition switch. And the yellow wires are constant power wires. The gray wires are the ones that give you like accessory power. Get off there. Yeah, gray is accessory power, so I probably don't need to have that hooked up, but I do. The red with light green stripe there is our fuel pump and ignition, so that has to be connected to power. And then the white wire with pink and white wire with red are the ones that go to the clutch switch to see if your clutch is engaged or not. So I just have that jumped right now with the fuse. And then there is an inertia switch over here. And if you get hit too hard in a car accident, you can hear that jiggling around in there, and it cuts the fuel and ignition. So hopefully you don't have a big old fire if you get in a car accident. So we'll probably keep that in the car. That'll be nice. Push it to reset it. No more jiggling. Cool, that's good to go. So all I need to do is put that red wire, and that needs to, yeah, so I need to put the red wire to the red with green wire, and then to start the car, we'll take that green wire, which is coming off of another yellow wire, and we'll plug that right into the white with red / white with pink stripe. And when I do that, that'll activate the solenoid for the starter, which is just kind of sitting there. And hopefully this thing will start up. I don't have any exhaust on here other than the header, so no muffler, so this is probably going to be a little loud, but with any luck, no fuel leaks, oil's good, wiring is okay, everything should just work, and we should be able to start this engine for the first time. Let's prime the fuel pump a couple of times. So there we go. Well, that's working, that's nice. It comes on for like 2 seconds and cuts off. Oh, we should probably put a check ball valve before the regulator so we keep the lines pumped up when this thing sits. Otherwise, we'll have to like prime it a couple of times before we can start it every time. Okay, note to self, order check valve. Okay, so bring the thunder? No, we're not gonna say that. Let her rip, no. Fire in the hole. We'll go with fire in the hole. Make sure we're not right in front of the exhaust here. Here we go. I heard something. Yeah. Okay. Engine runs. Great. Fantastic. Awesome. Yeah. Oh, it sounds pretty good. A little rough. Maybe it just needs to get its bearings back. I don't think I heard any misfires. It was pretty smoky, probably burning stuff off from, well, not having run for a while. Whew. I think I need to get out of the garage for a second. All right, well, the engine runs. Great news. That's fantastic. It sounded good. I didn't hear any clanking or clacking or any bearing noises or anything like that. It just kind of fired up and ran. No idea how long it's been sitting, but there you have it. It's running. So now we need to move on to a couple other things. I need to figure out the shifter cables, the clutch throwout bearing, all that kind of stuff. The shifter is there, but it's turned backwards. So I need to turn it around, and then I need to get new cables made after I do some research and work on that, because the cables themselves stop right about there. They don't quite make it to the transmission, so we'll have to figure that out. That'll be fun. I need to do the water pump. I need to do the auxiliary water pump, and then I need to do the water pump water pump pipes. They come up from the back to the front, get a bunch of fittings in 90 degree, 45 degree, all sorts of, silicone bends, whatever it is that'll hook all that up. I'll figure all that out. And we got to hack up the wiring and get the wiring in the car and all of that. So there's a lot of work left to be done, a lot to figure out. I do have some vacation coming up, so I'll probably work on the car during all of that and get things ordered. Oh, right, Christmas and all that's coming. Better order stuff soon. Anyways, everything seems to be working, and I think that is a good point to end the video. So thank y'all very much for your patience. I know it's been a couple months since I uploaded the last video. I do work on this thing every chance that I get on the weekends. I end up busy with a bunch of other things, but I do what I can when I can, and so I appreciate everybody that has subscribed, everybody that's left me a comment. Y'all are fantastic. I really do appreciate it. If you made it this far and you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. It's completely free. It helps me out. I'd like to grow this channel, and yeah, y'all stay safe. You have a great week, month, however long it is until I upload the next video, and I will see y'all on the next one. All right, bye.